Great to see you, Vala.
It's been a while, but it's a
been a
pleasure to
while.
be here as always.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, man.
As always.
And thanks for, first of all, thanks for everything, but thanks for reading the paper, though.
It was actually a pleasure, so no need to thank me.
And I think the best way to start it is maybe to describe what I try to do with this paper.
Exactly. So I guess maybe let me ask you at first.
Yeah.
What is your main argument and main point in your article? If you were to sum it up, like giving me an abstract.
Like to sum it up, I think the main argument that like I want to really highlight, because it's a little bit complex, but just in a sense that the U.S. behavior in foreign policy is driven by normative thinking, but constrained by realpolitik.
That's a very novel argument, which I haven't seen been made anywhere else. And I think this is something very interesting about your article, is that it brings something new, because, well, I personally, coming more from the field of history, have a beef with political science. Yeah. And I think it's very much a science that usually has a thesis at the beginning or some assumption, and then you just pick your evidence to support the assumption that you had from the beginning. And I can see that in your article, you really try to incorporate the views of all the sides involved. And I think that you came to your conclusion after you did your research. So maybe let me ask you, what inspired you to start making this research? Like, how did you come up with this topic?
I think, and it's a very good analogy to history and just being an observer of historical events, I remember myself vividly going through, my personal life, and then this crisis happened. In other words, I remember 2021 vividly. I mean, not the whole year, but the follow-up when, especially when Russia drafted the proposal to the US. I remember all the reactions, all the Twitter thing, and how actually like people and pundits in IR responded to it. And I just felt a little bit weird in the sense of I felt there is a just disjuncture between like what people, like kind of like a logical fallacy, in the sense that they try to promote a certain idea, but this idea doesn't have like that much credibility. And to be precise, this idea that, the US is not really involved in this conflict. So it's up for Ukrainians to decide. This idea, it still is there. This idea is it's Ukrainian future. It's up for Ukraine to decide its future. But you know what? It's up for the US to admit it to NATO. in a sense, without American approval of this behavior, there is no Ukrainian behavior.
Exactly.
And that what got my attention in a sense, because there's such like discrepancy between, and just people maybe don't pay attention to it because they're kind of like very drawn into this camp thinking. So, come on, people call Mearsheimer pro-Russian guy. I think Mearsheimer is anything but like pro-American guy, but like whatever, like they don't even call him a scientist anymore. But and just like these things aside, what like really like drew my attention, this kind of discrepancy, right? Mm-hmm. This idea that people do believe that Ukraine has a right to become part of NATO, but to become part of NATO, you have to have balls to admit Ukraine to NATO.
True. And
they don't have balls. It's sad. It's sad in the sense, if again, like what we discussed, if they had capacity to admit Ukraine to NATO right now, they probably would.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't they? What is your argument? Why don't they admit Ukraine to NATO, even though they openly say that they would like to admit them?
Because they're constrained by Russian power. They're constrained by the fact that they are afraid of Russia starting World War III with NATO over Ukraine. And they don't want that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But could you please elaborate on how in the article you discussed the reasons for why the US still retained this very normative rhetoric? So they said one thing, but they did the other. So even though they were clearly powerless in the face of, well, Russia still being a very powerful state. Why do they still retain this normative narrative that NATO has an open door, and of course Ukraine will at one point in the future become a member of NATO, instead of just going back to the negotiations of the 19th century, where spheres of influence were clearly divided and nobody asked any questions?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I think it partially has to do, of course, with the Biden administration, because it had to play this role of it had to show, like, European countries, EU, that it's a authoritative leader. It had to show its kind of authority and leadership in a way of thinking, because that's in a way of rhetoric, in a discourse, so just in the space of ideas, basically. However, like, undergoing this, I mean, and I just, maybe to summarize what they did, it's when things heated up in 2021, before the war, what the US did, instead of just saying, Ukraine cannot be member of NATO right now, right? They said something like, yes, Ukraine can be part of NATO one day, maybe. It has all the rights. However, it has all the rights to do so, and that was their major kind of like emphasis. And to me, for example, like what was so drastic when I was doing this research, and you have this Brussels summit communique. It's like 14th of June, coming 3 days before Biden-Putin meeting. It's like, imagine like Putin flying to meet with Biden in Geneva. Just imagine, like, just you are being those people. You are being Biden, like, I'm being Putin, and I fly to see you, like, first time in like ages. Like, it's a first meeting between American and Russian presidents in a while. Like, really, like, the last time was like Putin Bush, or like Putin Obama, whatever. Like Putin, like Obama, yeah, something. It's been a while.
Oh no, he also met with Trump, I believe.
Yes, he met, but it's like once in a while.
Yeah, it's a few years. Yeah.
And you fly to Geneva, and on the way to Geneva, as a Putin, you read Brussels Summit communique, and Brussels Summit communique, it's like, Ukraine will be NATO, and then that is like, it's just like, to me it was like, okay, but like, did they? And like, to me, it's still like the most puzzling question for me, when if I were to like kind of like deepen this research, if I were to collect like primary resources, go to like interviews with like Biden administration aides, and so like something like this, I would really want to ask them, but did you really understand that your every action contributed to the confrontation? Mm-hmm. Like, did you really understand that your every step that you took, it really kind of like put the oil into fire? Yeah. Like, it's like everything you did, there was nothing like there was no thing that you did that was actually to prevent the conflict. Everything you did was to kind of put the fire. And I mean, it's not to say anything about Russian regime or Putin. I just like, I hate the guy, obviously. Everyone does, like all normal people do. But it's just about like this idea how Americans actually behave, in the sense where they face the situation where something bad. I do believe they kind of like, they should have had a sense that something bad going to happen. Yeah. But they were like, you know what, Ukraine has a right to become part of NATO.
Well, Biden just recently called Xi Jinping a dictator during a meeting with Xi Jinping. So maybe his public, speeches regarding diplomacy aren't the best. But something that really puzzles me, and obviously you cannot have an answer to this question, is, was there any kind of diplomacy behind closed doors? Because, for example, if we look back at possibly the biggest crisis of the 20th century, so the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was eventually resolved diplomatically, but many of the agreements, the deal, were kept secret. So Kennedy agreed to withdraw American missiles from Turkey, but this was kept secret. So the Americans kept their face. They still pretended to be super strong and leader of the free world, not making any concessions. but in reality, they gave up something to the Soviets in exchange for Soviets retreating their missiles from Cuba. So obviously, you cannot answer this question because it's all classified, and probably historians will find out in 100 years. But were there maybe any tries to do so, or why wouldn't the U.S. engage with Russia and say, hey, publicly we have to say Ukraine will be a member of NATO, but don't worry, it will never happen, we promise you, behind closed doors? Do you think it was possible that somebody said that?
I think actually no, because, and the reason why, it's like, to me, it's simple, because they thought about like USSR as a peer competitor. They don't think about Russia that way. They think about Russia as a, and their thinking about Russia is really like, and you could see it through like IR literature. It's like a country with the GDP of Italy. Who cares? Like, I mean, no, in the sense like they do want to kind of like put Russia in its place, in the sense of they don't they don't believe that Russia has a word to say in a modern type of like environment. Like, it's not that powerful country. And that being said, I mean, to me, it's hard to believe. I mean, of course, and it comes also. I mean, I didn't put it into my research. It also comes in like other articles about the follow up of this war. That I think Biden's aide, when he traveled to Moscow and talked to like senior advisor, and talked to Shoigu, and he said, to Shoigu, you don't understand. You would suffer immense consequences. To Shoigu, you would suffer. And Shoigu replied to that, like, Russian people can suffer like anyone else. But you could imagine like the guy is telling the in other words, he tries to put the pressure, he tries to say that you suffer, but in a sense they miss the point that Russia is determined, it is determined to prevent Ukraine to become part of NATO. In the meantime, rhetorically, that's what the US is trying to do. It tries to do that Ukraine is NATO, even though obviously it's not.
Yeah. I mean, even though it's essentially rearmed as a NATO army right now, it will probably not become a member of NATO anytime soon. So we discussed the American perspective and the American approach, or maybe mismanagement of the situation. But what exactly was at stake for Russia? Why is Russia so opposed to Ukraine in NATO?
I mean, that's an interesting question. Of course, goes beyond my research.
Yes.
Like, my personal feeling is that if you think strategically, if you think 5-10 years from now, and I mean, if you are Putin, for example, you think about Russia as obviously a state that is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to, foreign interference, it's vulnerable to revolutions, it's vulnerable to the change in power. So it's a state that something can happen, in a sense that things can go not in a nice direction, right? And the consolidation of the state can crumble, and the consolidation of power in the Russian state can diminish or just significantly lower. So I think his thinking is if you go into the future with this idea that Ukraine one day becomes part of NATO, it will. That's it's just maybe in 10 years, and it doesn't really matter. It will. It will become part of NATO, and then you have this problem of Ukraine becoming part of NATO, while you have the question of Crimea being opened. No one wants to resolve the question of Crimea. Of course, you also have war in Donbass. So for him, it was probably just it's either we with all the power. In Russia was still sanctioned, was still not part of the kind of Western community. So it was heavily sanctioned. So I guess it was just now or never. Right? That's just either Russia asserts itself as a power, or it just loses everything in the future as a state. As a country.
So would you say it comes from a place of vulnerability, that Russia felt threatened?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it just comes from this kind of the policy, also of because if you think through American perspective, even if you just go before the war, well, I mean, yeah, they have like a, Russia is not a big problem, right? It's just it's not something to care about.
Yeah, it's a thorn in the side, but not an existential issue.
Yeah, and you can keep the sanctions like with Iran just forever.
Yeah.
Like, just for 30 years. And then one day, I mean, they probably also saw the developments in Ukraine in the sense of like bilateral, or not just multilateral military cooperation between Ukraine and Western powers. And I guess they thought, well, if Ukraine is, like arming itself, and if it really wants to get back Crimea, or who knows? I mean, I do think there was like for them, it's just a strategic threat, which means it wasn't like a immediate threat, but the threat that, I mean, if something can happen, that it will happen. Just think about it this way. It's like for them, it was like it was an accept. I mean, it's kind of funny because I kind of repeat Russian rhetoric now, right? In a sense, it's like it wasn't unacceptable to have it as a risk. Mm-hmm. It's like, and the risk is just there, and that just you have to live with this risk that Ukraine just becomes part of NATO. And for me, kind of like moving things forwards in the sense of like history, just you could see it, like when even Prigozhin coup, kind of like that attempt of coup like happened, you could see how close is to go like from Rostov to Moscow. It's not that far away, and it's very well connected. So obviously having NATO troops just on the border of Russia, it's a big threat to Russia. Yeah. And Russia, as you could see, it's not the US in the sense of military power. It's far behind. It's far behind from the perspective of just material.
Mm-hmm. So we very nicely discussed the American perspective. We talked now about the Russian perspective, but something that I think your paper does really well, which is something that not many people actually do in IR, is give Ukrainians agency as well. Like you spend some time talking about the Ukrainian perspective, which I feel is very often in IR, especially in the Rio school, they only talk about great powers and their objectives and their interests. So why was Ukraine pushing so hard to become part of NATO, even if this could potentially make Russia, well, pissed off?
Yeah, I think that's in a sense of Ukraine, that's the way they constructed, their foreign policy concept, like everything, in a sense, that just for them, it was a strategic path. And it heavily relied on the fact that I think they did believe that they would become part of NATO. And they still do. And they really do that once it happens, there is just a collective defense and no one can go to Ukraine. That's what they believe in. And they still do believe it in the fact that once it's over, that's the ideal world. So you have NATO on the border with Russia, and no one goes there because, well, if you want to go there, you have to fight with the NATO. And they constructed this concept, obviously for security reasons, because for them, they look at it as this idea that was promised to them, and in a sense is feasible, and everyone is like talking about it in a positive sense, and it's almost like it feels like an inevitable thing. But then you kind of hit the wall, you just always like hit this weird wall of no, you have to wait, you have to have reforms, you have to have, even though like Montenegro is part of NATO, became part of during Biden administration. It's like, do you really think like corruption is that better in Bulgaria than, of course maybe it's worse a little bit, but yeah, it's politics. It's not. The US, like Ukraine is not accepted to NATO not because of corruption. Everyone kind of like should understand. At least from my perspective, everyone should understand this. Yeah. It's obvious. It's just political will, and of course, here for me, so it's an interesting, because in going to the war, that was American behavior. That was like behavior of creating incentive for Ukraine to push even harder. That's for me is what I still, not I don't struggle with it, but in a sense I try to understand. Okay, but that's their involvement in the conflict, actually. They created these conditions for Ukraine to push harder. And they really kind of like incentivize Ukraine, like, go for it, go for NATO, go for it. It's like this like parent like supporting a kid, go for it, you're gonna get it, you're gonna get it. But like, but they I mean the US definitely understood that it won't accept it to NATO. So then here it comes like, this like for me, and I guess what I also showed in the paper, it's interesting from Ukrainian perspective, they didn't give a shit about any other country but the US. Mm-hmm. They only knocked on the American door. They just, of course on Brussels' door as well. But what is funny is like that Brussels is kind of like this, it's like, oh yeah, you're going to be part of NATO. Just wait for it. Yeah. And it's... of course, and I just like feel I could like I could also, in a sense, if you're being empathetic a little bit, and if you are empathetic even now, and you just like being Ukrainian official, and you just knock on this fucking door, and you're just like trying really hard, and then it's just like no, like and it's like the funniest thing that these people, they don't say they just like say, oh
in the future.
Yeah, one day.
Not now, but for sure in the future.
Yeah, and to me, it actually felt. Of course, it's like in the Ukrainian sense, it's sad, man. it's not a nice look for like neither America. Neither the US nor the Ukraine to be in this position. But of course, the US is just like can shove it off. It's like it's not something that is important for the US. Even image in the world now, but
But it's still very interesting that you mentioned that they mostly focus their diplomatic efforts on Washington. Yeah. But still, NATO, there are many different countries, and they all need to agree to let Ukraine in. So even if there was unilateral agreement in the US that Ukraine should become part of NATO right now, and the Congress would vote in favor, you would still have the entirety of the EU to convince, like not the entirety, but the entirety of European NATO members to convince, which I'm sure all the Baltic states would vote in favor immediately, and Poland and maybe some other countries, but Germany, like hell no, Germany would vote against.
But this is also interesting because when you have this, like for example, again the Brussels summit communique, and the Brussels summit communique is just the same as Bucharest summit communique. It just says. It just says that Ukraine is going to be part of NATO without mentioning the dates, without mentioning membership action plan. So, in a sense, no one said, no.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's interesting to me if this there is a, obviously it's just like a reality. There was a pattern. There was a thing to discuss. Like and like Hungary could say no. No to this communique.
Exactly.
But for some reason, no one said no. And again, this meeting, like imagine, like for me, from what I thought, I thought like, it's like this meeting happens just 3 days before they meet in Geneva, and then just like Putin quite literally on the fucking plane just reads this communique, and then he's just going to strategic reasons. Oh, and he probably thinks no, they're playing very strategic. What they want to do, they want to outlive. He definitely connects him to the Russian state. They want to outlive me, and they want to, once I am gone, they want to accept Ukraine to NATO.
Yeah,
that's what probably he thinks. And he acts accordingly. He pushes and he invades Ukraine. From very realist perspective, just realist perspective in the sense now, fuck you, it's never gonna happen. It's like, because I guess now it's we are almost 2 years into the war. It's
almost 3 actually.
It's damn clear it could go for 5 or 6 with the same type of positions, and because if there is no peace deal, hell, no one gonna think about accepting Ukraine.
Absolutely. But, well, you talked about the fact that Ukraine really believed that it would become part of NATO. And, right here in this room, I have a cap that I received from the Ukraine embassy in Warsaw, which says Ukraine in NATO now, which I guess still sends a message that Kiev believes that it can become a part of
Yeah.
NATO. But do you think that they still really believe it, that they will become a member of
They do.
NATO, or they just still keep up the facade because they have been issuing this statement in public media
Yeah.
throughout the last years? Do you really think that Zelensky and his advisors really believe that next year, or maybe in 2 years, we will be members of NATO?
But that's an interesting question. I think that's the whole complexity of the issue, because that's what you hear from the U.S. officials as well.
Yeah.
That one day it's gonna happen, but I mean, they do believe, because they base like the whole policy on it. So it's and again, this is just a struggle between, again, wills. It's like the one will, like on the Russian side, is saying that ain't happening, like, this. And the other wheel is saying that is going to happen, but it's not about like norms. It's just about this like policy reality. It's like either you can make it happen or not. And I mean, for Russia, it was way much easier to prevent Ukraine to become part of NATO than for US to go all in with Russia and fight with Russia for
absolutely.
Ukraine becoming part of NATO. That's what it's like, again, the complexity here, that if you look into just rhetoric, you're missing out, like, and you just don't see the clear, I mean, I would call it just the picture here, because there is some reality here. Because I mean, it's not just about rhetoric, it's not about the ideas, it's about how they implement them.
Yeah.
And I mean, and for me, of course, I mean, you couldn't really say anything about Ukraine, because for me, Ukraine behavior wasn't it's a disposition. So it was really promoted to behave this way. Like, it was like treated like, this open door policy. It was promoted to behave this way. And especially with Biden coming to power, because I guess I also showed in the paper that Biden was a person who was like a Ukrainian person.
Yeah.
And he was really deeply, I mean, it's also not a coincidence that this war didn't happen during Trump administration, right? It actually happened 1 year after Biden coming into power. It's not a coincidence. I don't think this is a coincidence.
But actually, like, information that this is going to happen were before Biden took power, right? At least, I think so. What the media was saying.
No. It's like it was 2021. I mean, the things heated up and just when Biden came to power. Okay. That's actually things heated up. It's like, with Trump administration, I mean, of course, Trump administration did some weapon deliveries, but there was nothing like, there was not such a big kind of confrontational dynamic.
Yeah, like, you remember once when Trump met with Putin, he said that he trusts Putin more than the director of the CIA. So that was something that was interesting. But also regarding Ukraine's bid to join NATO, I remember that like 2 months or like 1 month after the war started, Zelensky said something like, yeah, we can put off the issue of Ukrainian membership in NATO off the table. Like, we can accept that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO, but we want to be a member of the EU. So this was the position of the Kiev government for like 1 month or two. So maybe there was some willingness to actually discuss this issue when it was actually, looking like Kiev could fall anytime soon. So I wonder if Ukraine still now could revamp its position and instead say, yeah, Russia, go home, we will not be members of NATO, maybe of the EU, but not NATO. Is it still possible for them to change their position, or is it too late, or will they go all in?
Yeah, I think it's the issue of the most, I would say, disgusting issue is the issue of like this captured lands, right? That's just there is no way. I mean, that's why, of course, like Mersheimer argues that, of course, that's why Putin escalated and actually accepted them into Russia. So there's no way we can get back. I mean, and then I don't know. I mean, I didn't analyze it that in a sense that truly like when war happened.
Yeah, I know.
But before the war, it just, I mean, it actually amplified. Like, you can say, like, my research amplified during the war, because you have the same pattern all over again. You have Ukraine, like, it's also there was like the summit in the Baltic country, in like Lithuania, or was it like the Vilnius summit, and Ukraine. I mean, everyone was so hyped, like something gonna happen. They're gonna like not accept Ukraine, but probably give it like a 100% like statement that. And then it's the same thing. Yeah, I mean, Ukraine will become part of NATO without membership action plan.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, what's the difference? And then it's like, and the same, and Zelensky is like not going to press conference, being pissed, like, and like, I mean, like, you can almost feel the emotions here. Like, you're trying to push hard. It's like, they ditch you again. They like really ditch you again. And then you just like, like,
Yeah.
I just like, like whatever. Like,
This is actually very interesting because last year I took part in this workshop that was run by four Polish ambassadors, like to different countries, but they're like very veteran ambassadors in international organizations and stuff. And the scenario, we had like to role play a scenario of Ukraine applying to receive the membership action plan, and we had like to role play. Different people would play as different countries. We'll have to roleplay the interests of those different countries, and eventually reach some agreement. And the agreement that was reached was like, we said like no to Ukrainian membership in NATO. And I remember the ambassador who ran this entire workshop, who used to be the Polish ambassador in France, he said, he was like, wow, I'm actually proud of you guys, because I was scared that you are going to get consumed by this normative thinking of, Ukraine as a free country, wanting to become a member of NATO, that all of you will be consumed by it and say, yeah, Ukraine should be part of NATO, but you actually thought about interests of different states, and you role played it very well. It's like, I'm positively surprised. So it's like, wow, okay, cool. So somebody's thinking like realpolitik here. Like, wow, that's pretty interesting.
yeah, but it's an interesting interplay. It's just realpolitik. It's also normative thinking.
It's almost normative thing, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, on paper, in the discourse, it's just normative thinking. And of course, I would say you could even stretch this argument as far as to say, like, this partial support of Ukraine is also based on this normative thinking. It's just like, okay, can we give this to Ukraine until we're gonna like have like a big war with Russia? Okay, seems like we can give this like bit. Like, let's go like bit by bit. Let's go like bit by bit. Let's go. And of course, then Russia is looking at this, and also like Russia as a military power, it adapts. It's like it also looks at the whole like landscape, and it's the struggle is there. Of course, I mean, I guess it's hard to deny that this war has more to do with the like conflict between the US and Russia than it actually has to do maybe between Ukraine and Russia, in a sense. I mean, of course, there is like a component where two countries like really kind of like disagree with each other and like really kind of like hate each other almost. But there is like a bigger component is just this discontinuity between like America and Russia. It's like pulling into different directions, like really trying to exert power in Ukraine, literally. And this is like, I mean, I hate to say it, but yes, Ukraine suffers because of it.
Yeah, true.
It does. Like,
so would you say that Ukraine would have behaved completely differently if Washington had said, no, you're not becoming a member of NATO?
So I think my response to this would be yes, and in a sense, this is to me, if you assess, like if you really try to assess what is the involvement of the US in this conflict, so what's the responsibility of the US for kind of igniting this conflict, is this idea that they really try to push Ukraine into thinking that they just need to and again, like for Ukraine, they really put a lot of effort. It's not that they just sat around like and doing nothing. No, they tried hard. They constructed the whole, cabinet, the whole foreign policy thinking around this idea that they would become part of NATO. And of course, for them, it was just like as soon as possible. I mean, realistically, they were thinking, well, it's going to happen maybe in late 20s, like in the sense of like 29, 28 membership action plan. Yeah. And of course, if the US, and I could definitely, I mean, I could see the US advisor going to Kiev and saying, no, this is not going to happen. I'm sorry, but we also like talking to Russians, and it's clear that Russians are going to invade you. But if we want to prevent this whatever conflict, let's just say no. Like let's try to come up with some kind of like idea. And I mean, I don't say that it's going to be talks and going to happen, but if you just like throw it around and but that they did exactly the opposite, like, right? And you could also see it in a way that Ukraine behaved like and what I will also try to say, it's like, it's not that there was like after Brussels summit communique, there was also like Zelensky coming to Washington, and then you had like all those strategic cooperation agreements. That's like, they sound, well, I mean, incredible on paper.
Yeah.
I mean, they sound like kind of like Ukraine becoming like Israel for the US, right? I mean, they sound like there is a bilateral, strong, in all domains, like military, economic, like cooperation between the two, which of course, and then I didn't, of course I didn't put this in the paper, but then after that you could actually see the escalation from the Russian side, and it's like, okay, now we are serious here. Yeah. And then in December they drafted the agreement, the proposal for agreement between the US and like between the Russian Federation and like NATO and the US. And this is, I think, of course, it just triggered even more, because in a sense, then they were just saying that, it's like, you are not part of NATO, but you are the US ally. Mm-hmm. And, and we are going to defend you. And,
It's like politely rejecting someone.
Yeah. No, not, but I mean, to me, it's still, it's again, I just like what I try to think just through like Biden administration perspective, like what was they thinking there? Yeah. Because I mean, like, of course, one thing is to say that you could say like they didn't think about it, like they were stupid. They just didn't think about it going to lead to the conflict. It's like, another way is to say, for example, that they just really wanted to have, like, to protect this, normative, worldview. Or, like Russia would say, they were just like playing with Ukraine.
So, we're like slowly closing this conversation, but if I were to ask you, would you call the war in Ukraine a failure of U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, I think not in the sense that they're responsible for the entirety of war.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're not responsible for that, for the horrors that the Russians are doing. Not at all. But what I called it, and whether you liked it or not, it's actually a good question for you. I called it, they created, like the US created, power vacuum. Mm-hmm. They created like a vacuum that Russians used kind of mercifully, in the sense like they created a situation where American authority was ambiguous. It wasn't really like either we defend Ukraine as a NATO member because we want them to become a NATO member and they're a democratic country and they're undergoing reforms, or no. I was just like,
but like this strategic ambiguity is something that the Americans actually like to practice. And if you read some of the writings of political scientists from the US, for example, they believe in nuclear deterrence.
But in relation to NATO, where American word is credible again.
Okay, that's true.
And here you have a situation where it's not a NATO member, but it's supposed to become a NATO member. So it's like there was this. I would call it a power vacuum. They just created a power vacuum, and Russians look at it and just like, it's either now or never,
But then again, you could look at it from like a super realpolitik perspective, mm-hmm. and think about the interests of the US. Like, let's assume that the US is super selfish and doesn't care about the interests of any other state. Mm-hmm. You could try to sell the war in Ukraine as a success of the US because the strategic opponent, that is Russia, is currently bleeding itself out in a war in Ukraine which doesn't involve a single American soldier actually having to die on the battlefield. It's a proxy war which costs Russia more than it costs the US.
I mean, that's in a sense true, and that's what I also think. Well, I think and I had this feeling when the war was like 1 year, we were 1 year into the war that, I mean, you do need to pay some respect like to Russian thinking in a sense like it's kind of strategic. It's like they got into the war, and for them it's just like the war. The longer it goes, the more we kind of win. Like in the sense like it's kind of like it's like a crocodile. It's just like it got like its prey, and it's just like holding it tight until it kind of like suffocates. That's what they're doing with Ukraine. And I think that's maybe the same that the US is trying to do with Russia. In the meantime, it's just like it's the same type of. I mean, because again, it's not that the US thinks about Russia as a real competitor, but this goes on to like very, abstract, of course, level. But again, but do you think then that the US behavior is just a malign and they just really don't care about Ukraine?
No, I don't think so.
But then, like this thinking implies that they're just like bad guy. I mean, not bad guy, but they're just malign.
Yeah,
That they just don't care about you. They just use it as a tool against Russians.
and this is something that I know it's not based on any research, but I believe not to be true. I do believe that there was some normative and ideological background that motivated them to push for Ukraine to become a member of NATO. But maybe we don't know what's going on behind closed doors. We don't know.
But there's enough, like, to be honest, like just being an observer. There's enough. Again, like this thing with the with the Brussels summit communique and Biden Putin meeting. There's enough actually public evidence, even if you just analyze it. True. It's just like it's also. I mean, yes, but you also don't think there is that much coming out of a Biden-Putin meeting where Putin is holding Brussels summit communique and just reading that Ukraine is going to be part of NATO. It's like what they're going to discuss. It's like, what about Ukraine? Oh yeah, like I told him that Ukraine is going to be part of NATO, and it's like, and Putin going to like smile. It's like, yeah, sure. Let's see. We'll see. And,
so yeah,
I mean there's a lot. Actually, there's a lot. I think like people call it like now public diplomacy. There's just a lot there. Like there's just a lot of information available even for public diplomacy now. Because I mean there is like so much information on the internet.
Which I think is especially interesting, like this case study of American diplomacy and the case of Ukraine. When we look at Taiwan right now, because it's the same thing. Like Taiwan is not officially an ally of the US. The US doesn't even officially recognize Taiwan as a state. Yeah. But still, in many ambiguous communiques and information that DC puts out, they hint like, yeah, we're gonna defend Taiwan, or maybe we won't, or maybe we will. Yeah. Find out. It's pretty much the same, I would say, in many aspects.
It is the same. I mean, the one difference is that for them it's more strategically important.
Yes, it is.
And you go into like real politic thinking, and then
China's a bigger threat right now.
And it's also it has to do. I guess if they lose Taiwan, that they're gonna lose the competition.
Yeah.
So it's the same as, let's say, like for Soviet. It's like the same as for like Soviet Union winning Western Germany during Cold War. That's like probably the same in the sense of like the scope.
Yeah.
But Ukraine was never like in the spotlight of American politics. I mean, it kind of became a little bit with this like corruption issues and Biden and like whatever Hunter Biden stuff. But it's not like. I mean, but it's interesting how it evolves. Of course, you also see the progress, the evolution of America, like Ukrainian topic in American politics, and to see where it goes. But I mean, now to be honest, they owe so much to Ukrainians, though. Like Ukrainians, like are really keeping up like the Western idea now, and again, this is just from perspective of I wouldn't say even realist, but if you want to show your balls, you have to go in all in. You have to go and defend, I mean, in a sense, you have to go all in, not like using nukes on Russia, but no, you have to maybe go all in and defend Ukraine with troops on the ground, just to say, or even maybe how. I mean, obviously, Ukraine always and still wants like no-fly zone or something like this.
I think it's a very nice thing that you said that Ukraine is actually like fighting for the idea of the West right now, probably more than the West is.
Yeah.
I recently attended a conference where one Polish politician said, like, yeah, you know, we all of us were talking about those European values and values of freedom, democracy, and stuff, but right now the Ukrainians are the guys who are actually dying wearing the flag of the European Union on the battlefield. So
Yeah.
maybe you guys should think about that a little bit more. I was like, well, strong words, strong words.
No, for sure, and that's like, I mean, it's kind of a tragedy here, right?
It is.
And then, I mean, to be honest, my prediction is that the story gonna repeat itself in the sense like every year they have like this NATO summits. It's like usually in June or in July, and then they're gonna do the same thing. They're gonna have like Ukraine being like, you know, very pushy and it's like giving all these interviews. I mean, I remember I watched the Zelensky interview before Vilnius summit, and he said something like, if you just, and it is the same thing he said before, just be honest. Like, you know, I mean, kind of like this, like, if you don't want us there, just be honest. Yeah. Like, you know, if you don't want us there, just be honest with us. Don't like fool us around. But again, summit comes, and then you have like this. But then it's like, again, like this is like, how do you explain even this intricacy here, right? There's like this, something is there.
Certainly is.
And I guess like from like, you know, bottom up, from us observing to the top down people doing politics. In the sense, I mean, they're probably undergoing the same type of issue they had. It's like, well, we couldn't accept Ukraine, but what then we do? Like, I guess that's Biden saying, well, I mean, we could endorse NATO open door policy.
True.
We could say one day they will be part of NATO. And then when Russia invades, they say, well, but they knew that it wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
It's like, what? You just don't you see that there is just like some problem in your thinking here? I mean, either you think this way or that way, or just like
make up your mind.
Make up your mind. Exactly.
Yeah, well, the future, as always, in our podcast is looking grim.
No, it's not grim. I mean, as such, we're still almost 3 years into the war, so the life still goes on.
It does.
I mean, as I called it in the paper, right? It's still the biggest military confrontation on the European continent that never looks. I mean, World War II style of fighting going on.
Actually, more World War One right now.
Yeah, but there were some moments of World War
Some moments of World War II, yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, and like, I guess the last thing I would say is just, you know, I truly believe that you would never solve this problem without incorporating Russia. I don't really think so. It's like without in broader Europe, because then it just becomes the same problem as you have. I mean, you did have like a big fighting between France and Germany. They solved it. How did they solve it? Oh yeah, they incorporated them in the same security structure. I guess what we are facing now, same type of problem.
Yeah.
Just incorporated in the same security structure. Yeah, and just that's for the longer.
Well, I guess if history teaches us anything, is that mortal enemies can eventually become neighbors or maybe even allies.
I would even say that in some sense, Russian-Ukraine war doesn't feel that much national.
You think so?
I think so, actually. I think there is a distance between understanding that this war is thought by elites, actually, on both sides. I mean, I haven't spoken to Ukrainian guys, but it feels like there is a distance between, like, you know, how Ukrainian people even think about this war. There is understanding that this is something that is thought like by elites rather than by people.
Well, funny thing, that's exactly the same thing that Marxists said about World War One. It's not a war between nations. It's a war between the elites. Well, and when the nations realize that they're fighting each other at the orders of the elites.
was there like a quote that young people who don't know each other fight each other for old people who know each other, and
Yeah. It's pretty much the same thing.
yeah, I mean that's what they do. So there is a distance. I feel I don't think it feels like a complete. I mean the way, for example, the conflict in Gaza feels for many people. Like, you know, for people for Palestine, it feels like their struggle between like Israel and Muslims in Gaza. I don't think there is something like this magnitude between Ukrainians and Russians even. There is some distance, even though it's a war, same type of thing, but there's some like, you know, understanding that, you know, distance, like just understanding that this is just a war by elites, not by people. I mean,
Well, hopefully. I hope for some reconciliation in the future.
yeah, you didn't sound that promising. I mean, that,
Well, the elites have to change. I mean, I come from Poland, and right now Germany is our best ally. So,
oh yeah, tell me about it.
so yeah, like they murdered 5 million of our citizens, but we can get along right now.
It's Europe. It's just it's the struggle of communities trying to figure out that. I mean, but we are all kind of the same, though. That's. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's just like it's moving towards direction. It's like eventually we're probably gonna laugh and just like remember like the war between Russia and Ukraine.
That was silly, right? Yeah.
It was fucking silly for fucking Donbass. Wow.
Why would you? Why would you fight
shit
over
hole.
Donbass? Exactly.
Damn.
Well, I guess that's a nice conclusion to our conversation.
Exactly. I mean, that's the way they did for fucking Zasaloturingia, like, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, for like a couple of wars. I thought for this region, and then it's just like, remember this? Like, funny.
Silly.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Well, let's hope for the best.
hope for the best, and we'll see each other in the next episodes.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening.
Bye.